All right. Well, I think we are live here. Cool. Well, I'm excited to kick this off. Welcome, everybody. If you're tuning in, love to hear where you guys are calling in from. You can use the chat function down there in the right-hand corner of Crowdcast. If you have any questions, there's a ask a question. If you're new, if you're just joining in, give you a little rundown so you can ask a question there, and we'll leave some of the questions towards the end. But if anything comes up in the meantime, feel free to drop it in the chat and then also drop it into the Ask the Question. Awesome. Pittsburgh. Sweet. Sweet. So this panel, how can we ensure respectful, safe, ethical, inclusive, and sustainable sourcing for psychedelic plants and materials? I'm really excited about this topic. Really important, especially as things start to, I guess, move forward in the psychedelic renaissance, if we want to call it that. So I think this is a really important conversation. My name is Kyle Buller. I'll be the moderator here, and I'm also one of the co-founders of Psychedelics Today, a podcast and education platform. And on screen here, I am joined with Diana Negrín, Bob Otis, and Martin Terry. And we will kick off the first talk by Bob Otis, and I'll just give a little background. So Bob's a longtime steward of Oakland's Sacred Garden community, member of Chacruna's Council for the Protection of Sacred Plants, and was the founding chairperson of Decriminalized Nature Oakland. He is a clinical molecular informatics researcher by day, following psychology and religious studies degrees from the University of California, Santa Cruz. Bob earned a master's degree in divinity from the University of Chicago, and postgraduate cognitive science studies at the New York University led to professional work in life science informatics. Bob, anything else you want to add in there that we missed? I know we had to shorten some of these bios.
Well, thanks, Kyle. I appreciate the puppy bio. So thanks. I think we're good.
Cool.
We ready?
Yeah, we are ready. Kick it off.
Fantastic. So happy to be here. I'll just say it really gives me a warm heart to be sitting around the virtual table with such an amazing group of committed lovers of sacred plants and their cultures and traditions. It's a fantastic panel with Diana Negrín and Martin Terry and Anya Ermakova, Ruth Valdizon, and Miriam Volat, all representing different views that in some cases are related, in some cases a little bit distinct around what it means to engage with sacred plants in respectful, safe, ethical, inclusive, and sustainable ways. Just really feeling a lot of gratitude here for being here with this amazing group. And in fact, as is a tradition, I would like to kind of start out with a little personal prayer, not a sectarian prayer to a deity, but an expression of fervent desire and hope. I just want to say thank you, everyone, for our time together. Thanks to all that is for the existence of sacred plants, and for those who respect, steward, ally with, and carefully share knowledge of these plants and their sacred healing uses. Thanks that we are all here together and that we can openly discuss and legally grow most of the sacred entheogenic plants that we're talking about today in the United States and around the world. Not all of them, but many of them we can legally grow today. May our time together help us grow respect, care, and mutual trust with and for sacred plants and their traditions. May it help us to understand the landscape of discussion around ethics and respectful access to entheogenic plants and practices. Finally, may this time bring us personal insight and practical understanding. May it connect us, harming none, reducing existing harms, moving us away from misunderstanding, and towards atonement, restoring and repairing our communities and relationships to each other and to sacred plants and their traditions, ancient and emerging. And finally, may this time just bring us a little bit of joy in our hearts that we can feel ourselves and share with our communities. Thank you.
Thank you.
So today's, yes. Bia and I had spoken before this session, and she had asked me to sort of kick this off with a little context, because we're bringing in a number of speakers. We'll be respectfully engaging discussion around ethics and sustainability for accessing and working with sacred plants. This is actually occurring in diverse contexts: traditional, decriminalized, and regulated. And this group really recognizes that there are varying opinions within and across individuals and different groups from impacted locations. We'll ask if it's possible to respect and support sacred plants and their related traditions while engaging ethical plant practices in diverse societies, potentially on global levels. So a number of questions are relevant. We'll be hitting on these questions, different folks on different questions. For example, what does it mean to be respectful to the plants and to the indigenous cultures that have carried knowledge and stewardship of these plants? What are responsibilities related to indigenous cultures being consulted or even permitting plant medicine use? Are there plants and practices that should be strictly avoided by most or many individuals or groups? Is it possible for individuals from cultures that have been largely disconnected from sacred plants to be their allies? How can we ensure sustainability? How might decriminalization impact wild populations? Are there ethical and sustainable alternatives to venerated, vulnerable, and in many cases, debated sacred plants? So these are the sorts of questions that we're asking today. And I'm just also kind of reflecting, particularly for those who want to be asking questions, that we're not going to attempt to debate across difference in today's meeting or to solve all of the issues associated with this conversation. What we really want to do today is lay out the landscape. We want to offer an opportunity for diverse views to be heard. All of these views are held by individuals and groups with formal and sincere relationships to the plants and to related communities, and I really appreciate the work that Shakruna has done to bring this diverse group together. And we ask that your questions and comments also do come from a caring, respectful place with intentions towards healing and insight, prioritizing our diverse and shared communities over our individual egos and perspectives. This is a great opportunity for all of us to share and learn in mutually respectful ways, focusing on listening and learning as we share. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Now I'm going to get talking about the fun stuff that I brought for today. And I'm just going to discuss a few of the many ethical and sustainable alternatives to the venerated and in many cases vulnerable sacred plants. There are a number of deeply held sacred plants that are being warmly debated, primarily due to their relationship to recent and ongoing legal and political harms, in some cases to the specific sacred histories of the cultures or plants, and also to the actual physical vulnerability of the plants and related cultures. If people have been in earlier, you've been hearing quite a bit about peyote and its vulnerability in the wild as one example. So three of the main plants that are the subject of debate, while all of these have some, but some are a lot hotter than others, are ayahuasca, peyote, and iboga. These are three plants or combinations of plants that are currently considered particularly sensitive to work with. Peyote perhaps being the most, but ayahuasca also has been the subject of some warm, I'll say, debate with a large group of taitas or plant leaders arguing that non-indigenous people should not work with ayahuasca. And finally, iboga is also quite sensitive. It's a slower growing plant, and there's some concern that it may also be vulnerable. And so all of these are important. It's useful to dive into the ethics around working with those specific plants, and we will in this group, but it might also be useful to talk about less sensitive analogs that do contain entheogenic compounds with usefully similar personalities to these debated plants. I'll hold that while these plant analogs aren't famous, perhaps, that they are indeed sacred and they can offer effective and less sensitive access to soul healing work that can be truly effective with sacred plants. And I'll, having traveled quite a bit, I can state with experience that these plant analogs are indeed effective and can lead to true, deep soul healing experiences. They're not weak, second-class citizens in the conversation. So while we've been talking, I've had this beautiful passion flower here. You can see this is Passiflora edulis. This is an analog, you might say, to the Banisteriopsis vine, the ayahuasca vine. This plant actually does contain beta-carbolines, which have that monoamine oxidizing effect that's part of the ayahuasca experience. There used to be a lot of debate around passion flower as a source because, like cannabis, it can vary from the strength of hemp all the way out to something like sour diesel in terms of what it actually contains. So, you can find passion flower with very little beta-carboline. And in fact, it's harder to find really good ones that are effective. But this is one analog to the ayahuasca vine. Another analog is something that you can find at many what they call halal stores, or stores that feature a lot of Persian products. This is called Esfand or Syrian Ruth. This is also a beta-carboline source. It's quite effective, quite powerful. You can get this at a store in Oakland. You can also order these online. It's kind of hard to grow, but you can grow these. So we're talking about ayahuasca analogs. First, we talk about the vine. Now we'll talk about the bush, the Psychotria bush. There are a number of different plants that have alternatives to using the Psychotria viridis. This is an example of Acacia madenii, which is a DMT source. Let's have a little fun. Here are a number of different DMT and then DMT containing plants. Phalaris, this is called the big medicine variety. It's actually quite potent. This is called ice plant, Delosperma cooperi, beautiful flowers. Thank you for your beautiful flowers. This also will provide NMDMT and 5-MeO DMT and can be quite potent. Okay, so we're just talking about analogs, and I want to say that you don't need to work with those sensitive plants. You can work with analogs. That's one option. Moving into the peyote complex, into the mescaline side of things, there are many cacti that also contain mescaline, not only peyote, and these are lovely profiles. So here you see Trichocereus, grandiflora or varhuasha with all the little needles. Here's a lovely little classic San Pedro or Trichocereus pachanoi. Here's a lovely Tachymbolensis, Trichocereus or Echinopsis Tachymbolensis. Nice big cristata back there. So this is just a few of the many types of beautiful, beautiful, fast-growing cacti that grow wonderfully throughout much of the United States that are alternatives to peyote. Last but not least, moving into the Iboga family, we have some lovely plants here. Here we have a little Sanyanho, you can see it, Tabernae montana undulata with the Iboga alkaloids. Here's a beautiful Trachelospermum jasminoides or star jasmine. These will also vary widely from plant to plant, but these do contain, they can actually contain ibogaine as well as wakangine and Tabernae montane. So these are all alternatives to the more culturally sensitive or ecologically sensitive sacred plants. They grow wonderfully in many gardens in the United States, and I heartily recommend starting your own sacred plant garden, particularly with plants that aren't sensitive or debated. You may disagree at some absolute level, but just out of respect for cultures that have been struggling, you may not choose to work with some of the more sensitive plants. You can work with analogs. That's about all I've got for today, Kyle. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. That was awesome. Thanks for showing us your garden. Really beautiful. And really just awesome to know that there's alternatives out there. You know, we don't have to just focus on the specific, I guess you would call master plants at times. There's other alternatives out there. Cool. Thank you. All right. Next up, we have Diana Negrín, is a geographer and educator with a focus on identity, space, social justice movements. She's native to both Guadalajara and the San Francisco Bay Area. And much of her scholarship and teaching is dedicated to the study of two regions. Her current research examines formations and ruptures within interracial and cross-geographic alliances that surround struggles over Indigenous territorial and cultural rights. And she's also the author of Radical or Racial Alterity and Huirica, is that how you pronounce that? Youth Activism and To the Right of a Mexican City. Awesome. Yeah. And yeah, just feel free to add anything else that we might have missed here by trimming the bio a bit.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me as part of this conversation. It's always really humbling because I grew up in a very privileged household with a very intimate relationship with Huirica families and many Huirica maracate or healers, shamans. And I also grew up in a household that had a lot of really close relationships with some pioneers in psychedelics, people like Sasha and Ann Shulgin, for example. And so I'm always very humbled to now be in a place where I can speak a little bit on this long life experience. I grew up really around peyote as something that was venerated in a particular way, very specific to Huirica practices, Huirica territory. And so I just wanted to introduce what I'm going to be speaking about today, and I'm going to be looking down a little bit because I have some notes. But I'm going to be speaking from the perspective of a cultural and human geographer. And as I've mentioned, with a lifelong and very privileged experience understanding Huirica culture and territory and the psychedelics community, specifically in the Bay Area. And so my approach to this issue comes from a place of deep concern over many of the contradictions that I have seen appear across various publics who are interested in peyote as a psychedelic substance, and many of whom see it as a portal into New Age ancestrality. So I'm very interested in these cultural and territorial connections in my work. And this interdisciplinary background really gives me a commitment to the political ecology and cultural autonomy of the Huirica people. And this shapes a lot of my critiques that I will share today, but also my hope for a respectful and equitable path towards the conservation of peyote across these nation states that are just colonial impositions in the first place. So my talking points are really going to be divided along three main themes. The first is the commodification of the sacred, and specifically the commodification of indigenous culture and entheogenic plants. Secondly, the commodification of land, as we've seen through the destructive development policies in the Chihuahuan desert, specifically Wirikuta, which is the sacred pilgrimage site for the Huirica people. And then third, I want to think about what it means to move towards a horizontal and decolonial model. And I'm going to do this in 5 minutes. So, last night, as I was preparing for what I was going to talk about today, I was remembering how a little over 2 years I was at the Sacred Plants of the Americas conference that Chacruna and Dialabachi organized in Ajijic, Mexico, one of the most incredible gatherings of different practitioners looking at entheogenic plants, but also other psychedelic substances. In the closing of that ceremony, Auque Garcia Mijares, Huirica communications director for the Huirica Regional Council, moved many of us in the audience to tears when she reminded us that peyote is not simply a plant, therapeutic for all, but sacred to only a few. To not find peyote for a Huirica pilgrim is to face the deepest sadness, the inability to cumplir, right, to meet the agreements with the ancestors. And I'm going to quote Auque, quote, "More than just a plant, this is about the survival of a people," end quote. She said, we do not want to be dressed up to be an exotic people and for our culture to be prostituted and sold. Our culture must be defended. In that same gathering, Matsiwa de la Cruz, elder Maracame from one of the Wixárika communities, one of the most traditional Wixárika communities, felt discomfort at so many people speaking of peyote, enunciating the name of peyote. And he organized a discreet trip to leave an offering at the Jiriki, or temple, of Xapahuimeta there in Ajiquiqui, in order to appease the ancestors and peyote's being. And then Santos Renteria, a Wixárika lawyer, urged the non-Indigenous audience to understand that peyote is part of a whole. It cannot be isolated from the whole. And yet we often find ourselves speaking of it as if it was one of many potentially interchangeable plants that offer wisdom through the privileged taker. So I want to ask, rethinking what Alque spoke about, to not forget the gathering of voices that we heard from a couple of years ago and that we can still hear from today and tomorrow. What have we learned since then? And one of the things that I want to speak about is the commodification of the sacred, and specifically the growth, the continued growth of retreats and kind of ceremonial circles throughout different parts of the Americas, but even we see it in Europe. $900 to $1,200 USD, right, will get you an ayahuasca, San Pedro, peyote, cambó, and rapé retreat in Ecuador this summer. You can also get an all-inclusive shamanic package with ayahuasca and peyote and ancestral cacao. If you want to go to Cancun for Don Juan's teachings, you can pay $1,200 for 2 peyote nights in the jungle room of an exclusive hotel. Or you can go to the Mayan Riviera to Tulum for a peyote ceremony accompanied by Wixárika chants for only 45 euros. Or lastly, how about one of the monthly retreats offered in Costa Rica, where you can experiment ayahuasca, San Pedro, peyote, rapé, and coca for $1,800 to $2,500, depending on the installations. That, to me, is part of one of the issues that we have to tackle as a community interested in the conservation of peyote. How do we educate this broader public? Secondly, peyote is not just facing this commodification, but also the commodification of the land where peyote is endemic to. So aside from this ongoing mercantilization of Wixárika spirituality, language, and the use of peyote itself, we have learned that the extractive industry in these past years has continued to only become stronger. Today, mining supplies the so-called renewable energy industry. Silver and lithium are in ancestral lands in Mexico. Then in Wirikuta, there's also the egg industry, dry tomato farming, pipelines moving even more quickly and literally tearing up the landscape. Across all of these territories in the Americas run similar veins that have been under assault for some several hundred years. This assault is always filled with awe and disdain for the territory and the people. Take and displace. And my specific knowledge is rooted in Wirikuta, which is under the assault of so many different forces. So then how do we consider all of these different dynamics and move towards a conservation effort that is both horizontal and decolonial? And I want to think about one of the things that's been promoted along with this summit, which is this notion of decolonize your mind. What does that mean? What I want to emphasize is that we have to think about these deep contradictions found within a lot of the discourses and practices within the psychedelic movement. When people seek transformation and when retreats and shamanism appear in the commercial realm, the narrative is always one of internal bounty, facilitated by a plant that is never described as scarce, that is never understood in relation to its ecosystem, nor to the threats against those ecosystems. In the case of peyote, there is no abundance. So what does a wider net of users mean in the face of this scarcity? Secondly, peyote's place within the cultural matrix of Wixárika people and their sacred territory, and within the cultural matrix of an intertribal Native American church, also is deeply related to the challenges we are seeing with an expansion of new users who often look to these same traditions, seek out shamans, seek to reenact chants. And I ask, is this being done respectfully? What harm does the extraction of ceremonial practices and their reenactment in other geographies cause for Indigenous cultures and the Indigenous cultures that these practices and plants are derived from? How has the marketing of Indigenous spirituality, of Indigenous language, and their sacred plants worked against the best interests of these same Indigenous communities? So what can we agree on? And I think a lot of us over these years, what I've been hearing is that we can agree on the need to protect these habitats, whether it's the gardens in Texas, whether it's the Chihuahuan Desert in Mexico. Again, these are colonial boundaries. This is part of this broader, amazing ecosystem. It is not a desert. It is a semi-desert. It is a large, large garden that we all, I think, can agree on needs to be protected from massive development as we see mining continue to escalate. But also, I think the trafficking of these plants is something that we really need to get a hold of. So I've been thinking a lot also about Sandor's talk this morning, Sandor Iron wrote, right, and the need for cultural education. And I think that we can also agree on concerted efforts towards reforestation, towards conservation, that can geared first towards primary users and then perhaps towards secondary users. And I do think that this cultural education needs to occur for the larger psychedelic community to understand and respect the mandate around the specificity of peyote, its history, its cultural practices, the sensitivities around it, and also allow for there to be a decriminalization that can permit its study, its conservation, and its true respect. So I do think we need to move towards a place of humility as allies of Indigenous peoples, a place of collaboration and horizontality. We need to listen and understand that coloniality is premised on the ongoing appropriation, displacement, and distortion of Indigenous land use and culture. So decoloniality should be premised on listening and carefully working towards collaborative models across geographies and ethnic identities. And that's what I have to share for today. So I look forward to the question and answer.
Thank you, Diana. Yeah, I am looking forward to that too. These are some really important conversations and topics to explore. So thank you for presenting all of that. Let's see. Next up, we have Martin Terry. Martin studied English literature, biology, veterinary medicine, toxicology at Harvard and Texas A&M. He has a doctoral degree in botany, a broad interest in cacti, ethnobotany, archaeobiology, botany, phytochemistry, population genetics, molecular biology, and conservation biology. His academic interest in cacti and his passion for protecting vulnerable species of cacti, including peyote, dovetail effectively with his activities as the president of the Cactus Conservation Institute. And he's currently also a consultant for the Indigenous Peyote Conservation Initiative. So welcome, Martin.
That's an amazing introduction. Yeah, I think one of the things that came through is I have spent the better part of my life as a scientist, and as a scientist who was particularly interested in learning to listen to peyote. So I come to this conference as a scientist, but also as a human being. When I was young, my Native American mentors initiated me into the peyote ceremony and taught me to listen to what the peyote is teaching us. I'm glad that at this Psychedelic Liberty Summit, we are learning to listen to each other, which is incredibly important. But at the end of the day, if we don't listen to the peyote and hear its crying, all that we work for will be in vain. So what shall we do? If we hear the peyote crying, we'll see that while peyote will always take care of itself, it will not always be abundant as it has been and could be again if we pay attention. It is calling to us to pay attention and is calling to us to listen to the cry of the peyote and its children. Last year, about this time of year, Dr. Anya Ermakova, who will speak to you next, and I spent 2 months in the peyote gardens of South Texas, listening to the peyote as we took measurements of the existing peyote and its children. She will tell you in detail how a plan for sustainability is emerging. In short, it just takes blood, sweat, and tears. But having said that, I would add that qualified volunteers are welcome, but not until the pandemic has subsided. That's the short version. Thank you for listening.
Awesome. Thank you. That was quick. Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Martin. And yeah, excited for some more questions and answers. And up next is Anya. So we'll grab her on the screen. Hey, Anya. All right. Welcome, Anya. So you have a background and research interest in combining nature, conservation, ethnobotany, neuroscience, and psychiatry, interweaving and connecting these diverse paths through psychedelic science. You worked at the forefront of psychedelic research as the science officer at the Beckley Foundation, and also has provided psychedelic welfare and harm reduction at services like PsyCare UK and the Zendo. And you're studying conservation science at Imperial College London, where you're also studying peyote conservation in Texas. Anything else that you would like to add to your intro before getting going?
No, that's a very comprehensive introduction. Thank you very much. Awesome. And good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be able to connect with you all across the continent. I'm currently in London, and to be able to talk about sustainability of peyote. Could you all see my slides? Just testing.
We got them on. Thank you.
Oh, perfect. Wonderful. So today I'm going to talk about what is sustainability and what it means for peyote, because conservation and ecology of peyote was a subject of my graduate studies with Professor Martin Terry, as he mentioned before. In the scientific literature and convention of biological diversity, sustainable use means the use of components of biological diversity in a way and at a rate that does not lead to long-term decline, thereby maintaining its potential to meet the needs and aspirations of present and future generations. Sustainability is not a simple yes or no issue. It has three components: ecological, social, and economic, and all three must converge for something to be truly sustainable. In natural sciences, for a long time, discussions about sustainability only focused on the biological or ecological aspects. However, it is impossible to continue this without thinking of social and financial sustainabilities too. Social sustainability implies cultural appropriateness, social support, respect and understanding of other cultures and institutions so that can function in the long term. And financial sustainability indicates that activity should outcompete unsustainable alternatives. There are many challenges in estimating sustainability. It is inherently something interdisciplinary, and sometimes it's hard to bridge across different disciplines. Also, social, ecological, and economic systems are dynamic, so sustainability criteria for any system is not a fixed thing. So how do people even begin to understand this interdisciplinary beast? They create models in order to make sense of these complex interconnected systems. One of the most comprehensive conceptual frameworks in the field of sustainability was developed by Elinor Ostrom, one of the only two women to win the Nobel Prize. This framework is elegant and simple, yet is comprehensive enough to capture core elements. They are resource unit, which is actually plant or resource that's being harvested. Resource system, which could be a desert, a forest, a lake. The actors or people who are involved or users of the resource. And of course the governance, which not just involves the government or particular regulations, but also local and traditional knowledge that guides the use of particular resource. All these domains are relatively separate, but they interact with one another, thereby defining possible outcomes, anticipated or otherwise. The biggest advantage of this framework is the ability to adapt it to different concepts. And the main use of it is to in conservation sciences is to assess sustainability using the key markers that were identified through many empirical studies in different resources. So I'm going to use this framework to the case study of peyote harvesting. Peyote doesn't need introduction. You've heard wonderful talks of people who spoke before me, as well as Sander Ironrope and Kevin Finney, who talk at length about trade. But I have to emphasize that peyote is a cultural keystone species. It's a sacrament and medicine vital to many, for traditions of many indigenous people. It's also in the United States a Schedule I drug. And then it's also classified by International Union for Conservation of Nature, vulnerable species, known for its decline across not just Mexico and Texas. And in Texas, the situation is especially dire. The exercise of applying this framework for peyote is going to appear reductive. And we'll look at peyote from a different perspective that you're used to. You might think of peyote as a sacred plant, as a medicine. So counting cacti and calling them resource units is weird. My lens and my background is that of a conservation biologist, although I worked in mental health before. And I view peyote as a vulnerable cactus in peril. But temporarily looking at it as a natural resource, we can apply what we've learned from other challenging conservation problems. And what I also like to see is to move beyond thinking about peyote in solely one category or another, whether it is a natural resource, a trade commodity, a sacrament, a medicine, a Schedule I drug. It's all of these and more. We need a more integrated approach to achieve positive outcomes. So what are those outcomes that we want to achieve? The outcomes are twofold, and none of them is more important than the other. We need to make sure that peyote is harvested sustainably, and the overall ecosystem health, ecosystem where it grows, in Texas, it's Tamaulipan thorn scrub and Chihuahuan desert is healthy and functioning. We also need to guarantee access to peyote for religious, medicinal, and cultural purposes for the members of Native American Church, the vital sacrament. Now I'm going to apply a few key indicators from the framework I mentioned before. And I'll start with ecological sustainability because this is my field of research. There are various important things. So you can look at plant part that is harvested, the distribution and habitat specificity, population size and growth rates, reproduction, ecological integrity of the landscape, resilience to natural disturbances, resilience to harvesting. And you can score that using various indicators and using particular features pertaining to peyote. As you can see, there are lots of unknowns. Ecology of peyote is one of the least studied aspects of this plant. There is lots of studies in anthropology, cultural history, but not so much in ecology, surprisingly. But what we do know indicates that potential for sustainable wild harvesting, given the current situation, is not very high. And if you look at the broader socio-political sustainability, such as what harvesting practices are used, what are other land use contexts, one of the biggest threats for peyote is not just harvesting, it's changing the land use patterns, because a lot of land is converted to agriculture for improved pastures, which completely eradicates all cacti, including peyote, on this land. And also what is important is governance systems. And current governance systems are not flexible, adaptive, or informed by ecological knowledge in any way. Moreover, monitoring and enforcement is not as effective as it can be. There is a lot of reports of poaching happening in South Texas. There are restrictions on who can harvest and where, but not when and how. We need to know a lot more to understand even ecological sustainability. We need to know ecologically sustainable yield, and some research, there is already some research in this area. We need to develop rapid, reliable, credible peyote inventory techniques, which was part of my research. develop clear evidence-based guidelines on harvesting quotas and techniques, and many more. But more important than that, we need to consult and listen and respect the beliefs, wishes, and opinions of the Native Americans, but also the landowners on whose land peyote grows. Most of peyote in Texas grows on private land, so they play a big role in potential conservation and access to it. We also need to think about rewilding, including peyote into habitat restoration efforts. Understand the effects of governance systems. For example, what would be the effect of decriminalization, because we don't know yet what the effect would be and how it would affect gentle ecosystems. So in conclusion, ecological or environmental knowledge is not enough. And sustainability is an amalgamation of cultural, economic, biological, political, and social elements, all important and indistinguishable. We also need not forget about environmental and social justice, including rights to cultural diversity in terms of knowledge and practice, and listen to each other, sensitivity, respect, and understanding. And last, I wanted to draw your attention to an initiative that we are developing in collaboration with the SIA, Comanche Nation Ethno-Ornithological Initiative, a Mother Church of Comanche Native American Church. We are fundraising for purchasing land and greenhouses for cultivation, which could solve both pressures placed on wild plants and supply challenges faced by future generations of Native American church members who choose a path of cultivation. And I have to stress, not everyone believes that cultivation is a way forward. Not all Native American church members and churches agree on this, but we're working with the Comanche Nation and they are for cultivation. Thank you very much for your support and attention.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Dr. Ermakova. Up next, we have Ruth Valdizon. So Ruth is a spiritual practitioner of the Peyote Road for more than 30 years and has been of service as a water woman for various spiritual leaders of the NAC. She's an educator and earned her master's degree in special education while raising 5 children. Her and her husband envision the conservation of the peyote cactus due to its decline and unsustainable harvest for consumption. Her main concern while witnessing the decline of wild peyote populations is to preserve its natural habitat, inspired by conservation by consumers, and find solutions and alternatives for propagation. Ruth advocates and respects the native-based cultural use of peyote for ceremonial purposes with an emphasis on conservation. So, all right, excited to hear you present, Ruth.
Yes, my name is Ruth, and I want to say greetings to all the public present here today. And thank you to Chacruna Institute for organizing the first virtual Psychedelic Liberty Summit. A personal thank you to all the technical people and moderator, Kyle. And also a personal thank you to Via Lavache, Josh, Bob, and Mark, who have been a shining light in coordinating and communicating to make this event happen. So, and again, thank you to all the public. Thank you. A warm thank you for asking me to speak on behalf of Morningstar Conservancy today. We are a nonprofit grassroots organization whose mission statement is basically to protect, preserve, and restore the native habitat of the Lophophora williamsi in South Texas. Our vision is the protection of peyote through the education of the public on conservation and sustainable harvesting practices. I just wanted to say, also just give a little background of how it is that Morningstar came to be as an organization. We are all basically long-time members of the Peyote Native American Church, and in various areas of the U.S., there are different tribes represented in our board of directors. So peyote is unique because its native habitat is limited to a small region, ranging from the Rio Grande Valley in southern Texas to the top of San Luis Potosí in Mexico. And it has been facing challenges such as the cattle ranching, wind farms, oil, unsustainable harvesting practices, and urbanization. Peyote's wild populations have decreased dramatically. The present infrastructure of peyote dealers, pickers, and consumers is contributing to the unsustainable harvesting of peyote. This present system, which allows for peyote licensed dealers to obtain leases for harvesting of peyote. And however, these licensed dealers hire temporary workers who get paid 25 cents per peyote button, regardless of size or how the peyote was harvested. Also, these dealers continue to overharvest their leased ranches, and therefore they resort to buying peyote that's been poached by various pickers. And I just wanted to say that I have personally witnessed this system. But when I was in southern Texas, I was able to speak to some of these pickers, and I got first, testimony of how they go about picking the peyote. And then one of the things that they all told me was that the peyote has been diminishing so much that they have to actually walk a lot further than they used to. They used to just be able to jump the fence and pick the peyote and then, get a sack of peyote very quickly, but that's not the case anymore. They actually have to walk way further to find peyote, and that oftentimes they just found it in very small amounts and also in size. So one of the questions that we have as an organization is how can we ensure the sustainable harvesting of peyote's wild populations for the consumption of those who use peyote as a sacrament? And we have come to some, or understanding that we need to create alternatives to the present infrastructure, and that these alternatives lies in the voice of those who really care about peyote and the people who believe in its conservation and also who use it as a sacrament. So the people, I believe, need a voice in order to implement a new system which allows for peyote to repopulate or propagate and create guidelines ensuring that peyote be protected as well as allowed to flourish. I believe that the classification of peyote as a Schedule I substance has not prevented this sacred plant from becoming a threatened species. It's the opposite. It's actually is the result of being a Schedule I. And also the fact that these sacred plants throughout time has been demonized. A lot of these sacred plants, unfortunately, people don't understand what they're about and believe the things, such as, the demonization of these plants. So this manifestation has created a vulnerability and has made the peyote as a threatened species, and with no plan for a future conservation. Morningstar, we consult with Native American board members for the guidance and advocacy of the future of the conservation of peyote. And our intent is to show respect for the future generations, that they might have the option to utilize all plant medicines, including peyote. Our goals is to educate the public about the challenges that peyote is facing, also to encourage Native American church chapters to include clauses in their bylaws for conservation. I think that that's one of the main goals for our nonprofit organization is to educate the public and have enough conscious conservation, towards conservation of peyote so that they can include these clauses in their bylaws. So encourage the local chapters as well to build greenhouses for the propagation of peyote in order to save wild populations, and also educate and support sustainable and proper harvest of peyote. We believe that plant medicines have been here since the beginning of time and have a relationship with humankind. The human race needs plant medicines to communicate with the divine nature. It's an innate right and essential to our global consciousness. Humans need to learn to respect all plant medicines, just like the water is all part of this creation. These all need to be treated as sacred. Plant medicines are needed for the future generations. Peyote is an essential plant medicine and guide who helps us heal spiritually, physically, and emotionally. And thus, humans, we can become more balanced individuals, part of healthier families and communities. Peyote, the healer medicine, has a unique way of teaching us to align with our higher self. It teaches to helps us, and it teaches to evolve as humans with a responsibility to preserve and conserve it and treat it as holy. Our conservation of peyote requires awareness of its vulnerable position as a plant species and simultaneously acknowledging its unique spiritual, cultural, and historical plant predominantly used among Native American people. We believe that there should be access to this peyote as long as there is treated with respect, and as long as it's the cultures that have been using this peyote are also treated with respect. We can have advocacy groups working towards the conservation of peyote, and we can come together in alignment with NAC leadership towards protecting and restoring its native habitat and its species. Morningstar is committed to educating the public to achieve awareness of its fragile status, also to create solutions that will stabilize the existing wild populations of peyote. And that is basically my presentation today. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate this talk about conservation and everything. So important. And yeah, I'm excited to dig in more with commentary during question and answer. So we'll bring on Miriam. And while we wait for her to come on screen, I'll introduce her. Miriam Volat is a soil scientist and co-director of the River Styx Foundation. She works personally and professionally to promote health in all systems. She works as a facilitator, researcher, educator, and community organizer to increase broad-based community and ecological resiliency, especially in Native communities. Miriam has never stopped exploring nutrient cycles and soil ecology, which was the emphasis of her master's work at UC Davis Vegetable Crops Department. She also has degrees in political science, environmental studies, and her life's work at River Styx now includes the support of psilocybin and MDMA research, including those involving religious clergy, deep eco ministry for direct experience, religious transformation, composting toilets and human bodies, indigenous medicine, land and cultural conservation, supporting balanced relationships between humans and our ecosystems. And as a mom, she's fortunate that her daughter Cora also supports her work and participates passionately on her many adventures. I thought that was an important sentence to leave in there. Welcome, Miriam.
Well, thank you. And thank you to the conference organizers, Chakruna and Bia. Just on this panel alone, I've just been so appreciating all the different wisdom and different perspectives on knowledge that are coming, and it makes me hopeful for conservation. I'm sharing today as an ally to Indigenous medicine conservation. I do have the incredible honor of supporting the Indigenous Peyote Conservation Initiative that Sandor Ironrope, who's on our board, spoke of, and Martin Terry is on our board as well, as their director during its first formative years as a formal organization. I also serve as co-director of River Styx Foundation. You heard some of the things that we do in my intro, and we are philanthropically committed to Indigenous medicine conservation. I also am an ecologist, and like Kyle said, I'm a mom. I'm also an auntie, beekeeper, gardener, worked on ag and water issues a lot. And I share that because in answering some of the questions that Bob posed, I feel like we all, including myself, are, I don't know about decolonizing our minds. That would be great, but at least ecologizing. I want to ecologize my mind. And I draw on those parts of myself in order to help me track relationships between things and really thinking about the whole as much as possible while balancing individual needs. I like to imagine often that on this planet, there's these thousands of cultures with even more histories, all kin, but also so gloriously distinct. How I see it is that we have different roles and different responsibilities. And in being committed to justice and rights, sometimes we lean in, sometimes we stand up and really protect things. Sometimes we back off and leave things alone and just pay attention and listen. I do want to thank Kevin for laying out some of the context and realities of Indigenous peoples today. I'm going to try and skip some of the things I was going to share because so many people have shared so eloquently. But, as we heard at the introduction of this conference, there's this incredible moment we're in where there's a psychedelic movement or something that's flowering into mainstream culture in many, many different ways. And alongside that, there's this precious, life-affirming, beautiful conservation story of Indigenous peyote conservation taking root on this continent. These kinds of efforts are happening other places. We're going to hear from the United Medics of Yahe of the Colombian Amazon, Ricardo and Miguel, about what's happening there. Troy and the Comanche effort that Bia shared about is happening. There's our leaders coming together in concern for their medicine, dealing with the complexity of laws, which aren't even necessarily truly their way, deciding to unify around that conservation. And like Diana said, I'm going to look at the term she used, cultural keystone species, or maybe that was Anya. It's not just the plant when we talk about conservation, but also their people, their culture, land rights, the health of communities, Indigenous communities' ability to address dis-ease in their own way, their very way of life and identity. And so peyote is really a biocultural, ethno-ecological entity. And if we think of it this way, then we can respect it and give this conservation movement opportunity to grow. Not just the plant, but the authority of Indigenous people to have their own self-directed conservation movement. So IPCI is a pan-tribal effort to address the supply and demand issues and problems that have emerged over the last 100 years, thinking about everything from the root of it, the life cycle of the plant, the landowners and ranchers, the many, many different cultures and people, always thinking about where do we start? Where do we want to be in 100 years? This conservation ethic is growing again on this continent with Indigenous people like a baby into today's realities. We're visioning for 100 years what the land will be like, weaving in the wisdom of thousands of years into that. On the land that IPCI has in the gardens. The board imagines many, many native languages, playgrounds for children, a welcome center, spiritually and ecologically tended medicine available in as much of a supply as people need for ceremony, planning ahead for the experience of children and grandchildren in as many ways as possible. These are really old prayers becoming new and learning how to be in the future. So I wanted to share some of the strategies that we're utilizing. First, we have 605 acres, this spiritual home site that serves as a hub for pilgrimage, community reconnection to the medicine, youth education, a network of ranchers and leasers that supports ecologically and spiritually harvested medicine. In other words, a harvest that regenerates the plant. Deep, long design processes for culturally appropriate nursery design to repopulate native habitat. You've heard from some other people that there's cultural issues around this, and so we're really working really hard to discuss those. We have meetings about the conservation movement and development. We have a conservation manager home, bathhouse, ceremonial grounds, and offering gardens. The land isn't for harvest, but it's a spiritual home to deepen and reconnect with medicine for the Indigenous people whose lives are twined with it. Our plans include a native distributor and alternative spiritual and ecological medicine distribution, conservation representatives in various reasons, and really supporting the capacity of all the different groups involved. We have a lot of community opportunities to be conservationists. So for me, when I think about these questions about ethics, I do think about being a mom and ecologist, and I think about how, at least for me, when I really love something, when I really learn about it, when something becomes more amazing and beautiful than you could possibly imagine, you know, like your favorite place or your favorite flower, then it's precious and then it's sacred, and then we have to take care of it. And we have to behave ethically. And so, you know, like many people have asked today, what does that mean? And so in preparation last night, I was like, okay, should I have a list? And here's what I thought of. We can adjust ourselves to holding that we are in the midst of the 6th great extinction. We have climate and water crisis. And to love the diversity of this earth is with all our might is what we need to do. And so with that, I would consider, I kind of sound like a mom at home with 2 teenagers during coronation. But listen first. And Martin said that. Do your best. Different plants are different and need to be cared for in different ways. Consider the unintended outcomes of what you're going to do, the ecological, the cultural, the relational. Be ethno-ecological thinkers. Consider biocultural entities, not just a part here and there. If you want to partake of sacred medicines, consider where they come from. Don't do anything you think might lead to poaching or pressure on native gardens. For those of us with choice who don't have our very life and way of life combined with a certain plant, we can choose from others, like Bob shared in the introduction to this panel. Start with reciprocity. Support Indigenous medicine conservation. Deeply consider choosing plants or fungi that are abundant. Deepen your knowledge of all these complexities. Even the UN is working on this in the human rights, UN Indigenous rights document. I'm going to read this now. It acknowledges that all nations should give priority to Indigenous people on traditional knowledge, culture, and genetic resources, recognizing that respect for Indigenous knowledge, cultures, traditional practices contributes to sustainable and equitable development and proper management of the environment. And we do have great examples of preferencing Indigenous people into our thinking, not that they're the only part of it to protect sacred species like salmon, like whales, like how hopefully we're starting to do with water. So I hear these conversations recently in these conferences that psychedelics not only can address personal trauma, which of course has many, many social benefits, but also address raising environmental and climate awareness, and that they can be utilized in peacekeeping and conflict resolution and that these direct experience of the divine help people to connect with unity and also with complexity. So in my opinion, the stakes are high about how we conduct ourselves, but I think we can navigate with respect. And thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Miriam. Love those guidelines at the end. Awesome. So now we will switch over to Q&A. So we'll have Bob, Martin, and Diana join us at this moment. Hey, Mike, you want to drop that question in the Q&A just in case it gets lost? Awesome. Well, that was a really great panel. I'm excited to dig into more conversation with you guys. All right, sweet, Mike. Thanks. Well, while we wait for Bob to get here, anything that stood out between you two from this panel really quick?
A lot of discussion about the interaction of people with organisms in their environment. I like that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I really think all of these voices really bring together what's, I think, core when we're talking about sacred plants is that interaction that Martin just talked about, that everybody laid out in different configurations. And I do think that we're so used to this rapid pace, and peyote is not about rapid pace. And I think maybe coronavirus is teaching us that we need to slow down, and that includes slowing down our process when it comes to interacting with sacred plants.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And maybe for those that don't know, I don't know if I don't remember anybody touching on it, but how long does it take for peyote to mature? I mean, it's a very long process for a plant. Right, about like 10 years or so.
That's a very reasonable, it can be a lot more. I mean, how long do you want to let a grandfather peyote grow? Then you're talking maybe 40 years to get to that size and potency.
Yeah.
So this is one thing, maybe this is a question for you, Martin, for me. Do you think, what can we do to get the broader public to understand this timeline? Or maybe this is a question that other people can speak to as well. But I think understanding this growth is really crucial to understanding its conservation, but obviously also its consumption. What might be some strategies educationally?
Very excellent question. I don't have the miraculous answer yet. Just a minute.
Hey, Bob, you made it.
Hey, fantastic. I caught Martin thinking about something. I was going through questions while we were listening. Shall I call out a few for us?
Sure.
Yeah.
So there was a lovely question from Colleen for Diana, asking, how can we best support mestizo people in Wirikuta so they don't have to sell land, for example, to mining companies? There's a question on how we can support.
Yeah. Right. So I think the first thing to understand is that isn't exactly what is happening. People, these are, in principle, a lot of the residents of Wirikuta, who are small farmers, have historically lived on communally held land. And many of these small farmers are, in fact, indigenous people who, because of colonialism, had really been displaced in many ways from language and culture. So really these small farmers are allies to the conservation of Wirikuta. The media has done a great deal to kind of distort this and make this into kind of mestizos versus the Wijarika, right? Indigenous versus non-Indigenous people. And I think that, many of my friends that are working on the ground are seeing, for example, that the diocese is very intent. The priest local to there is very interested in conservation. The small farmers understand these plants as well. They understand their properties as well, including peyote. And I don't like to isolate peyote from all of the other species that are there. And so I do think that there are great popular education efforts that are also needed on the ground. But it's not so much the people, right, who are there selling the land, but it's the Mexican government and the politicians who are brokering deals that are undemocratic. And I think that is a much larger struggle in many ways. And so we do need to be aware of that and stop. I think there has been a lot of pitting the locals against the Wijarika in this movement to protect Wirikuta.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Another question for Diana. And we'll kind of move down the list, and then we'll probably, if we have time, we'll invite Ruth and Miriam to come in a minute. There are questions for everybody, but here's another one for Diana. It's sort of a subtle question. I think it's a good one. So let's see if we can get it right. This is from Angelina. And she's asking, how are we, and others, Martin or others may have thoughts on this, how are we to toggle the delicacy of healing with the commodifying or colonializing, as well as the conservation of cultural sacraments without cutting off the psychedelic revolution? So I think it's trying to say that they're asking, makes sense? How should we approach the responsibility and stewardship of these sacred plants while we at the same time facilitate healing to the, quote, masses, right? So how can we scale up to the masses without going into commodification of the sacred is what I'm hearing.
I don't know if I can answer that question, but I do feel a lot of unease with what I would call a circus act that comes along with a lot of these psychedelic movements. I do think that they're, when you see, and I've interacted with some of these people, I've asked them specific questions. Do they know where they're sourcing their peyote from? I get either, silence, or I get, well, it's mediated through an actual Wijarika individual, right? And what we know is that Wijarika people are being put in jail in order to source these plants to tourists, right? And so this is tied to the tourist industry. And I do think that we need to understand the tourist industry as a form of extraction. And I think that's quite different from people entering into these relationships with these plants through, individual relations, through more intentional ways of being. I think it's very easy to go on a website like Retreat Guru, type in peyote, and then, if you have a couple $1,000s to spare, there you go. I think that is a problem. And I think it's very unfortunate that while Indigenous people are being criminalized for these plants, that there are other intermediaries who are making money off of this. And this is on the this is on many websites. These things are easy to find. And so this is something we need to wrap our head around, because I understand the sensitivities of people wanting to heal. But as we've heard from you, Bob, right, there are alternatives. And I don't know if we should be mixing all of these plants together in a 10-day retreat. I don't know if that's safe. I don't know if that's going to be up. So I think we do need to be more careful.
Right.
Oh, no, I was going to say, as an alternative, Mike had a question about San Pedro being an alternative to peyote. And would you see that as sustainable or ethical?
Yeah. And in fact, hit it, Diana.
No, that's a question for you. I don't have that answer.
Yeah, good. And I do kind of want to jump in a little bit on both sides of this question, because there are a number of emerging, and I think it's going to shake out over the next probably 5 years, sort of ethics bodies in this space. So, for example, Chacruna itself has the Council for the Protection of Sacred Plants, which at least is looking at law and ethics and best practices, right? And so Chacruna is publishing a lot we're looking at how do we balance, scaling up with good practice, those sorts of questions. There's a group called Sacred Plant Alliance, which is also being helped and sponsored by Chacruna, that's looking at best practices with churches of various types, sacred plant related churches. And then I know Joe Moore and Luke from Psychedelics Today and Psychedelics Time, as well as another group called OLP Therapeutics, and others are getting together to look at creating a self-regulating ethics body around clinical type of work. So, I think this focused move towards self-regulating bodies where there's transparency and guidance is another direction in the space. We'll see how all that plays out over the next few years, where the folks who are attempting to practice with good ethics should be reaching out to vet your own practice, like Diana was saying. Where are your materials coming from? How are you relating to the indigenous groups that may be associated with those materials, etc. There were a lot of nice questions for around the specific plants. I guess what I'll do, the first thing I'll say is yes, San Pedro is a lovely, faster growing cactus that does contain a fantastic profile, including substantial mescaline. It can be very effective. And members of Sacred Garden community have at least had conversations with, for example, Quechua peoples in Andean highlands who have said, hey, what do you think about modern folks, Westerners, using these San Pedro types of cactuses? And the curandero pointed to the side of the mountain that was just covered with beautiful Trichocereus or Echinopsis cactus containing mescaline, and saying, nature is generous. That was the comment there. So that's not a blanket permission from an indigenous group, but those cactus grow quickly, and they're great alternatives to peyote, in my opinion. Also, for the sacred garden questions, I think what I'll do, rather than try to answer each question directly, a lot of folks are asking, how can I get my own sacred garden started, and those sorts of really beautiful questions that I love. I posted a couple of links in the chat. There's that little ethical and sustainable access article talks about a lot of analogs, and it also talks about plants that are sensitive, so you can see that. And then a little self-promoting quote: if you look at Sacred Garden community, that's a great way to actually get connected to plants. And we try to do our work within Sacred Garden community, being a part of these ethics bodies and doing a good job. So hopefully, if you're reaching out to Sacred Garden community, we can help you get started in what you might call a good way. Mm-hmm. Okay, and thanks for jumping in with your thoughts around the commodification. I think that was super important. There was a nice question for Martin that I think is a really important one, because it calls to something that's a little bit more closer to the heart. Paloma had asked Martin, what do you mean by listen to peyote? How do you listen to what it has to teach you? What do you think peyote has to teach?
I think the best way to answer that question is, first of all, put your own body out in the natural habitat of peyote, and then just sit down, feel where you are, look at all the incredible components of that environment, and check in with peyote frequently while you're doing this. I think you'll find it very worthwhile, spiritually.
Okay, that sounds good. All right. Let's see. There was a question about decrim nature that Bia just texted and said I should make sure to ask. So let me see if I can find that question. I'm not seeing that question, Bia. Can you type, if there was a question about decrim? Oh, here it is. Are there any, here we go, I see it now. Are there any, so Decrim Nature, the Decrim Nature group that I had been a part of, and then I had resigned when it became a little bit more expansive politically, a lot more active than my group would be on a sort of broader political stage. They recently published a an article just yesterday called Peyote's Call for Unity. I don't know, Martin, did you get a chance to read that, or Diana?
No,
I'm afraid maybe no one.
Yes, yes, I
You
did.
did. Do you want to make any comments on that, Diana? Any thoughts?
About the statement?
Yeah, Peyote's Call for Unity.
Well, I think my first question would be, who's speaking for peyote in this manifesto? Who is part of this unity? And I think it's premature to issue a declaration prior to really working across the different groups of people who have been deeply involved in peyote, its tradition, as well as its conservation. So I think that would be my first point. And I do think that it has a tendency to reduce the complexities of both Wijarika uses as well as other Indigenous peoples' uses, including the Native American Church. I think all of these practices are much more complex. And while there's some really great points towards the need to decriminalize, right? I think that law has been a big problem here. We can't fetishize it at all as the solution. Certainly, we can't preempt dialogue through declaration.
Mm-hmm. So I think the dialogue is important. It seems appropriate that people will have different views, and then views are open to shared understanding and maybe becoming a little bit more refined as we learn from each other, right?
Absolutely. And it has to be horizontal, and it has to be a dialogue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agree. Okay. We've got a few more questions. Can we invite Miriam and Ruth into the session?
Yep.
Thanks, Diana. Thanks, Martin. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I like that there's a lot of questions here about alternatives and the analogs, and a lot of questions
why don't I talk about
here,
that
Bob.
while we're going? I'll talk about a few things. So that link I pasted is one link that's got a nice list of plant analogs that are recommended. All of those analogs on that list, Sacred Garden Community can make available as well. I love to share, barter, and trade plants and cuttings and seeds. So take a look at that link. There's also a fantastic epic book called Pharmacotheon by Jonathan Ott. That's the real classic. I think I started to cut my teeth on a book called Grow Your Own Stone that was published back in the 70s. I do welcome anyone to reach out to me. That's just a big question. There's not a great single, simple, easy, here's how you can start your sacred garden book that I've seen. But there's a lot of diverse books in the space. Taylor had asked about Illinois bundleflower, Desmanthus illinoisensis. I actually I was on a walk with Jonathan Ott 15 years ago, and I asked him what was the hot, new, exciting secret for analog plants, and he said, Illinois bundleflower, Bob, check it out. And it can be quite potent in the roots. It grows all over the Midwest. It grows wild in fields. It looks kind of like a little miniature mimosa. You can see them growing. It's a wonderful little plant. I have trouble getting it to grow in Oakland. The conversations around sacred plants can go on all afternoon. So I think there are a lot of nice questions. I do want to encourage people to reach out a little bit more directly if you'd like. And I see we've got Miriam here.
And Ruth is here as well. Yep.
Oh, fantastic. Okay. We got a couple nice questions for Miriam and Ruth. I think either one of you guys might be able to answer this one. How do peyote using cultures feel about growing and harvesting peyote from a greenhouse or in other artificial environments? Does this alter the experience of, okay, that's the first question. So how do, either one of you guys, how do peyote using cultures feel about growing and harvesting peyote from greenhouses or artificial environments? Thoughts?
Well, I can share a little bit how we're working with that question in IPCI. And like I said, we have over 40 tribes represented within this initiative. And so all of those tribes have different cultural norms and different ways that they think about these things. And so, when I said what I recommended is patience and dialogue and really talking, that's happening internally to these conservation efforts as well. And you can imagine, just like, I think there's a book called Democracy is a Series of Endless Meetings. And I saw some notes here, like the old ways or the good ways, where we sit down and really talk. And that all takes time. But we are working on culturally appropriate nurseries and really considering all of these cultures coming together, the indigenous peyote peoples of the Peyote River, meaning the United States and Mexico. And we also include Canada in there because there are people who have taken on this medicine to help them find their indigenous identity more recently in history, to look at this exact question. And so we have kind of a series of things we look at. First is proper harvest, meaning ecologically appropriate cutting in the proper way so that the plants can regrow. And along with that is spiritual harvest, meaning harvesting with offerings, with prayers. That's across the board in all the different traditions. Then when we get into how do we repopulate these sacred gardens, we have a lot of conversations, and we're looking for this place where people come together on what it looks like to do culturally appropriate to everybody who's in this conservation effort repopulation. And it's really, I'm a white ally to this. I'm there as long as they need me, and mostly I work as a facilitator, and it's been incredible and beautiful to watch this, watching old culture essentially come forward to form this new way. And so I know I didn't directly answer the question, but it's just, there's a lot of difference and there's a lot of richness in that difference, and it's finding its way. Some tribes which are really just operating just on their own can just forge ahead. Some of them are fine with greenhouses, some of them aren't. There's many different cultures. I think the trick for us with being allies is to, again, like Martin said, listen. And for me, that means listening to kind of the direct, sort of intimate family of the peyote about how they want to proceed with their conservation. And so I hope that kind of answered the question. I think it's easy to kind of jump to a conclusion about what's needed. And sometimes, I'm learning to just wait and listen some more and see what emerges when there's, prayer and medicine and hopes for the future all coming together.
I want to come back to what Martin Terry said about being present with the medicine, with the peyote. And I believe, that it's a very complex question, what you're asking, whether everybody's going to come together and believe the same thing about how conservation should look like. It's something that is evolving. And I think that it's a great opportunity for people to be present with the peyote and have conservation in the form of cultivation, because not everybody's going to be able to go to Texas. I mean, in all reality, some people in Canada use peyote in Native American church. And that's a long ways for people to travel from Canada to Texas. So I think that there will be people that, it would be a great opportunity for them to be present with that spirit of peyote. And from what I learned about going to the peyote gardens and being with the peyote in the gardens is that it has its own spirit. You don't even have to ingest it. If you are in tune and you pray in that place, that spirit is going to come to you, and you don't have to ingest it. And I think that's also across the board with all plant medicines, and even other plants, just medicinal plants. I was told that when you go and harvest medicinal plants, you're supposed to pray, give an offering, and as you harvest, you always leave a patch so that, in order to honor that plant and make sure that that plant is going to continue to flourish. So I think that you can have that same approach in a greenhouse. You could pray, you could have people understand how to harvest it, when to harvest it, how to process it. There could be a whole, educational process for people to know how to connect with the plant in a deeper way, because that's one of the reasons why I think people have this disconnect, because they don't know how it's growing. They don't know where it comes from. And even though you can go to Texas, you can almost have like a little piece of, of that Texas right there in your own garden. So I'm not saying that every state is going to be able to, to do this, because there are states that prohibit, the cultivation of peyote, but there are some states, like I know in Arizona, there's extensive gardens of peyote, by the Church of God, Peyote Way of God, of Church of God, I think it's called. Anyway, so that's what I think, that really is very complex and it is evolving.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think a primary point that we're hearing here is that these native gardens that have these very complex ecologies that Martin spoke to, where, just on the spiritual home site where we don't harvest, it's this hub. I think, I've actually turned into an acacia lover. We have 16 different acacias there, and the acacias are these incredible nurse plants that when they drop their leaves, they're very, very high in nitrogen. They're actually nitrogen fixers, and that's part of what allows the native habitat. And so I think the message here about peyote is that it is a threatened species. It's listed as such. It's connected to all these cultures, and we don't want to harvest it from the gardens and its native habitat. And whatever happens there, it's best if the indigenous people who have a direct relationship with it help do that conservation effort.
Right. And I think that, thank you so much, both Ruth and Miriam. And I think in many ways, this conversation does revolve around that term respectful. What does it mean to be respectful of the plant? What does it mean to be respectful generally? What does it mean to be respectful of others, quote unquote? What does it mean to be respectful of indigenous cultures, right? So I think we can engage in a respectful way regardless, which is the primary encouragement. And then there is diversity of opinion and strongly held feelings around whether or not, for example, it is appropriate to be respectful towards the peyote plant, to grow it in a greenhouse. I think that's a valid perspective that should be heard. And Sandor, thank you for commenting on the side a little bit around that. In fact, we had hoped that Sandor was going to be on this panel, but he's presenting in other areas in the same conference, so wasn't able to be on all of these. So there's diversity of opinion. I really love that we're able to come into this discussion within this group in a respectful way. It's really helpful. There have been a number of comments around, in the side chains and questions around alternative plants. There's the Trichocereus or Echinopsis genus that has many different types of cactus. Many know of San Pedro, which is a faster growing plant. It's not vulnerable right now in nature generally, so that's a nice option. There was a question here for me that I also really enjoy. Can we address the traditional uses of some of the analogs we shared? For example, where can one find more information about how to use Syrian rue, acacia, and others? There's actually a wonderful book by Mike Crowley called Secret Drugs of Buddhism, and he's been doing a lot of research in the Middle East and sort of global research. And for example, we're talking about analogs. There is apparently a high order Sufis in areas in the Middle East who will work with a combination of the Syrian rue seed, which is a seed right here, and something called Arundo donax, which is like a giant phalaris grass. I showed phalaris grass earlier. Arundo donax is a really big, like looks like bamboo. It's giant grass, and we have that growing in Oakland as well. They'll combine Syrian rue and Arundo donax as a meditation aid. So that's a nice example. A lot of people have heard about Soma. That's in South Asia. India and Vedic religions, that's considered to be probably Amanita muscaria, but also maybe other mushrooms and other combinations. This is a big conversation. There's a lot of really interesting stuff about acacias in the Old Testament. Even the Ark was made of acacia, and the Ark contained different mixtures, of which more shall not be stated. It says in the Old Bible. And when you would go to the Ark and to the secret Holy of Holies, you would enter the presence of God. So whether or not there's something that has to do with acacia, those are interesting questions. It's a lovely conversation. Again, I'll direct you to a couple of Chacruna publications for a little bit more information. I encourage you to reach out on that. How are we doing on time, Kyle? We got just a couple more minutes.
We only have a couple more minutes left. Yep.
Bob, can I just say one thing? Is that okay?
Sure.
I'm seeing it here in the chats, and it strikes me that the way we're talking about this medicine of this continent here, which of course is where a lot of us live, and so it behooves us, is analogous to some of the other medicines. Like in the chat, I just see a lot about iboga, and I know that iboga is also threatened in its native habitat. And so that's another one for people to pay attention to how to be respectful in
thanks for pointing that out.
So.
And just on that thread, I'll recommend there are a number of wonderful plants that are very beautiful that have iboga alkaloids, including ibogaine, that are not tabernanthe iboga. So that's the kind of thing I'd love to talk more with folks about. I guess we're going to wrap up now. There were a number of other lovely questions. I think maybe we can leave, as this is a question for us to all meditate on. The question was, I think someone had mentioned reverence. And so the question was, what is reverence? And I think that might be a nice way for us to lead. I do believe good work with these plants will teach us to have awe and reverence. And so may we proceed together as a global community and within each of our communities from a place of appreciation and reverence. And I'll go so far as to say love for these sacred plants, for the traditions that have carried them to us, for the ancient and indigenous traditions and the emerging traditions. May we proceed with reverence and love for healing and well-being for each of us and for our communities. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for closing like that, Bob. Awesome. And thank you to all the panelists here. This has been a really great conversation. And thank you for the Psychedelic Liberty Summit for putting this together.